Næsta langar mig að kynna Sandrine Dixson-Decléve og ég ætla þar að leiðandi að skipta yfir á ensku. Sandrine Dixson-Decléve is a global leader in the areas of climate change, sustainable development, green finance, and systems thinking. She sits in several international councils connected to the EU Commission, and she is the co-president of the Club of Rome, which is a seriously impressive organization. For those of you who have not maybe heard much about the Club of Rome, it is a platform of thought leaders who identify holistic solutions to complex global issues. And they promote initiatives and actions to enable humanity to emerge from planetary emergencies. So you know the small stuff that they're talking about. She is also the co-writer of a brand new book called Earth for All, a survival guide for humankind. And I've read it, I can absolutely recommend it, especially for policymakers and company leaders. So without further ado, I am proud to present Sandrine.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and apologies to all of you for not being able to be with you. Actually, I'd hoped to be there in person, but unfortunately, due to family matters, I'm not. I wanted to lead you through the evolution of some of our work from limits to growth to an Earth for All, a post-growth model. And in particular, indicate to you why we are, first of all, where we are today. If you look at 50 years ago and the limits to growth, you can already see through the scenario development of the model that was used by the system dynamic modelers of the MIT team, that actually some of those scenarios very clearly indicated that we would be in a series of tipping points in the 2020s. And this, of course, was linked to continued population growth, the absolute impact of this population growth on the need for natural resources due to overconsumption, and of course, then the detrimental environmental impacts, but also the juxtaposition of growing inequalities and poverty. And I'm going to lead you through the journey of some of our reflections as we come to today. In particular, also 2 years ago, when we very much wanted to commemorate, but also mark the limits to growth by coming out with a publication as to where are we today and what therefore do we need to do about not only the polycrisis, but what we're now calling the permacrisis that is before us. I would like to reflect a bit on the links also with other thinking, and in particular, having just come out of Davos and the World Economic Forum, and looking at the fact that actually even business communities, top business leaders have indicated that the top 10 risks, both in the next 2 years, but also in the next 10 years, are related to social and environmental tipping points. And you can see that even the WEF, which has been quite conservative and neoliberal in most of its thinking, is now very much moving towards the approach that the Club of Rome has taken, which is the juxtaposition between social and environmental tipping points are going to be our greatest existential risk. And that is why, at least in terms of the Club of Rome, but now we're seeing a broadening discussion around transformational economics for the 21st century. Because we know that if we do take the premise of the limits to growth and overconsumption, that is because of the current neoliberal system that we have in place that is predominantly determined by GDP growth and productivity. And this reflection is very much around the need to transform the economics for the 21st century, very similarly to what is already being done in Iceland in its conversations around a well-being economy. But what's important here is the fact that there are a series of different economic models or conversations that are occurring at the same time. mission economies, green growth, post-growth, donut economics, beyond growth, including well-being economics. And as we shifted into a discussion, moving us towards the publication of Earth for All, we were very clear inside the club that what we wanted to do was embrace most of this thinking and come up with some key principles of what is it that we're all trying to achieve, even if there are variations within these theories of change. One is clearly we have to shift from an extractive GDP-based economy. That is fundamental. And we need to start to measure that which is most valuable in our economies. Interestingly, referring to Bob Kennedy's speech in 1968, which says just that we don't place a value on that which is most important. We need to also account for social and environmental risk in financial and economic decision making. And we need to understand the links between our over-financialized economy today, which is about shareholder premise and in particular short-term profits, in comparison to the real economy and how we can actually service people, planet, and prosperity. We need to also expand our perspective of public goods and socialize the rewards of environmental and social commons, place a value on these rewards, but also take into consideration these rewards in our accounting and our budgets. For example, in conversations with Brazil and other countries that actually have tropical forests, putting that as a positive on their budgets and on their accounting sheets in order to demonstrate that this is actually quite a positive shift within their economy and a public good, which they are offering not only to their citizens, but also to the rest of the world. Correct the inequity between high and low income countries created by international finance and trade systems, but also take into consideration growing inequity and inequalities within nations, in particular in the global north. And then finally, and most importantly as well, ensure that we start to broaden the diversity of our economy, increase the agency of women and workers to drive the direction of the economy, understand that the parallel economy should be part of the economy, as we saw during COVID. I think this is very important when you take into consideration the growing malaise across the globe and the fact that if we look at surveys that we've undertaken, that global well-being is dramatically declining. This also came out in our well-being index. But then when we actually surveyed citizens in G20 countries, 74% of them want a well-being economy. So how do we start to make this shift? What does this look like in practice? I'm going to go to the next slide. Sorry, it's not working very well. There we go. So this shift for me has been very important in terms of our thinking and in terms of the body of analysis that we are trying to offer decision makers across the globe. We continue to use as the foundational piece of our thinking the limits to growth. But within that, we take into consideration the incredible work of the scientists like Janúarráðstefna and others from the Potsdam Institute who have looked at the planetary boundaries. Within that, then in 2022, we published Earth for All, which has now been translated in 10 languages, where we've taken into consideration some of our system dynamic thinking, but also juxtaposed the way in which we've worked with economists from across the globe, in particular in the South, and brought in some of their new models, their new thinking, including some of the donut economic modeling from Kate Raworth and others, well-being economies, into a new narrative and two key scenarios, which I'm going to lead you through. But then we've also tried to translate this into current international decision-making today. And we offered some of this thinking in understanding what is it that we've done in terms of the SDG stocktake? How does this match some of our thinking from an economic perspective, but also both some of the modeling we've done and some of the stress testing we've done with economists on the ground? This is one of the spaghettis of some of the modeling that we undertook, which started to demonstrate to us that actually, if we don't take into consideration the way in which our planetary boundaries are also, and the speed and action that we can undertake within the planetary boundaries is actually a function of the speed of action of inequality and poverty, then we will actually not move forward in our decarbonization goals, in our sustainability goals. So the social tipping points have become increasingly more prevalent in our thinking and in the way in which we are designing recommendations for policymakers. This is very important in terms of the types of scenarios that we start to undertake in Earth for All. Because what we're saying is you either have the first scenario, which is the too little too late scenario, which basically it's our business as usual today scenario, and the giant leap, which is what if we achieve the fastest economic transformation in history? And what would this actually look like, taking into consideration the body of thought that we have in front of us and some of the new thinking? This means that bringing all that together, we've realized that there are 5 key turnarounds. And what's interesting is in our analysis, those key turnarounds, if we look at the cost potential of GDP, it would be between 2 to 4% GDP cost per annum. You can start to look at scrapping some of the defense budgets. I know this is important for some countries, but also the perversities in our market. And we could actually very easily transfer those funds in order to make these 5 turnarounds a reality. Oh, apologies. What are the specifics of those 5 key turnarounds? And ladies and gentlemen, this is very important when we think about bringing the next step of sustainable development to reality, and also in particular, meeting the complexities of 21st century challenges. The first 2 are the most important: ending poverty and addressing inequality. With regard to ending poverty, the highlight is to reach a minimum income threshold of US dollars 15,000 per annum per year. And within the book and within our thinking, we unpack that both in terms of how we work with low income countries to create those possibilities of a minimum income, but also how we start to work with the international financial institutions to create the fiscal freedom to be able to enable those countries to actually focus on people rather than paying back debt or looking at trade deficits. In addressing inequality, something which is fundamental, and actually I've been speaking about in a recent op-ed in the FT just last week and also at Davos, it's really starting to put in place the right taxation policies that tax the wealthiest 10%. So that they take no more than 40% of national incomes, because today on average, they're closer to 60%. So this means progressive taxation. This means wealth taxation. This means starting to take into consideration the potential for citizen funds. Linked to that is the acceleration of gender equality, the transformation of the food system, and the transformation of the energy system. In terms of the acceleration of the gender equality, even our report to the on the SDGs to the Secretary General that we presented actually earlier last year, we very clearly indicated that both in terms of climate change, but also gender equality, we will never meet our goals, probably not, by the way, for the next 100 to 200 years if we continue on the same path that we're on. So we have to move into radical transformation in terms of the way in which we bring women into decision-making, enable access to education, but also the way in which we transform the food system and our energy systems. Importantly, transforming our food systems towards regeneration and transforming the energy system to put in place the carbon law pathway of cutting fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases by 50% every decade to reach net zero. So here's a quick analysis through a series of different graphics of where we can be in comparison between the too little too late scenario and the giant leap scenario. And you can see that in each of these graphs, we start to see a dramatic change when we apply these 5 key turnarounds already in 2040. So for the next 15 years, if we were focusing in this way on very specific recommendations that we've put in place, policy recommendations, we could start to see a radical change in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, which, by the way, is continuing to grow. And again, as I indicated, in some of the wealthiest countries, having just come back from San Francisco, we know very clearly that most of US cities have the highest inequality ratios we've ever seen, highest rates of homelessness, of suicide, and also of drug addiction that we've ever seen this century. But this also means that we actually can start to see a growth in social tension. And for us, social tension and social tipping points are absolutely at the most extreme rates that they've ever been, and will only grow if we continue on this too little too late path. With social tension, we see a variety of different risks. Now, first of all, we know that we cannot achieve well-being if we do not deal with inequality and growing poverty. But we also will see that social tension is directly linked to the fact that actually well-being is decreasing in most countries if you take a variety of different factors into account. And this means that inequality also reduces trust. If you look at, for example, the trust parameter that is being placed in particular in the United States, we've seen that wage inequality in the US has increased by 14% between 1970 and 2010. But since 1978, US CEO salaries have increased by 1,460%, while employee salaries by 18%. And we have therefore seen a growing increase in the level of decrease in the level of trust, which also translates into a growing seizure of those most populist parties, and in particular the right. We can see the way in which Trump plays the discourse of both trust, of fear, of inequality. And we also are seeing it play out now, unfortunately, in the European elections and the way in which we're seeing a real shift across Europe. Now, this is a real problem if we don't deal with rentier capitalism. What we're saying very clearly is that today's over-financialized economy, the fact that we do not have an economy that actually is organized around production, consumption, and exchange, but that money is made on money, and that the shifting of values of various assets from stocks and bonds to real estate to intellectual property and crypto is actually continuously enabling a growing wealth within the pockets of the few rather than the many. So the manipulation of these financial assets really now dominates economic decision making, and this is becoming problematic and is part of this growing inequality. So what we have wanted to do is to propose the possibility of setting up citizen funds to distribute the wealth of global commons fairly, to look at the role of government with firms and producers, but also to take into consideration taxation policies, regulation policies, subsidies to expedite restructuring. And in addition, to reform the international financial system, also to enhance equality between the North and the South. What is fundamental within all of this is to put in place the progress indicators that we need in the context of well-being economies. And of course, this is, again, very important in the context of Iceland as one of the models that we have before us alongside Wales, Scotland, and New Zealand to demonstrate, and Finland, that actually well-being economies can move forward with a broadening of the indicator base to truly measure what is important in our economies today to foster well-being for more people, but also to ensure that we live within the planetary boundaries. So let me quickly move into what does this look like in terms of a redesign of our financial system? Because we have to take that redesign into account if we move into a new economic model. This means that we need to fundamentally move from just creating a systems change, which is a Band-Aid approach within the financial system, of trying to basically continue to finance change, as we're seeing within decarbonization, rather than changing the financial system overall. We know that the current financial system is a major hindrance in phasing out the old economy, and that the continued dynamic of economic growth at all costs has really catalyzed this overly financialized system. So we must actually have a financial system that fosters an economy in support of the financial system rather than the reverse. And this shift, it has contributed obviously continuously today to a lock-in and unsustainable regime, which means that we've been focusing on maximizing financial value creation rather than the optimization of servicing people's needs. And this is the growing risk. This is the growing pain point of the inequality that we see today. And as I say to investors and I say to business leaders, please realize that growing inequality and growing social tension is bad for business. It's bad for democracy. It's bad for security. Therefore, you should be worried about this, and we must work together to create this new system. That's also why we're working with patriotic millionaires and billionaires who have understood that actually wealth taxation is fundamental if we're going to move forward. So we need a regenerative financial system that really shifts from an extractive to a supportive financial system. And that means that it's a system that's directed by purpose. It's a system that favors integrated value, that takes into consideration a whole of system goal and policies, practices, reporting, and regulation. And it's a system that requires institutions to become active agents in a coherent and collaborative strategy. So this is looking at long-term value creation embedded in stakeholder-oriented governance. It also means that we need to then think about, well, what are the main barriers to changing this system? We have to start working on, and that's what we are now doing in terms of commissioning a series of research and analyses to look at the role of finance and the misplaced purpose. We then need to understand the real goal of finance and move away from the narrow notions of value. We need to look at what then are the tools. I heard taxonomy, and I'm sorry, my Icelandic is not very good, but I think the last proposal that came up was to talk about the taxonomy. Having sat on the taxonomy group for 3 years, the taxonomy is just a small part of one of the tools that we have in our toolbox to look at new criteria and metrics that actually do place a value within our financial system on nature, on people, and truly enhance prosperity. We have to look at our flawed mathematical models and our flawed methodologies, and then understand what is the agency of finance. Currently, the passive mode of operation is truly a problem. And then how do we actually rebuild our relationships, and what type of organizations do we need in place, both at the international level, but also at the national level? Reminders on top of the presentation on your screen. Okay, apologies. I'm finished. What I wanted to end with is that we truly believe this is a unique moment in time. We've had a series of shocks, COVID, climate change, and increased conflict, which has forced actually us to reflect on what really matters. We're in the midst of an emergency, and we have 6.5 years and counting to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis and the compound effects of other crises. And we have the will, which is 74% of people in G20 countries want transformation towards a well-being economy. So what we've tried to do over the last year since we've published the book is to make sure that these messages and these narratives are being taken up. And we've actually been gobsmacked. We've been stunned at how this narrative has really started to grow across a variety of different countries and regions, with now the book being translated in 10 different languages, but also in particular around a variety of different audiences, from Wall Street, where we actually launched the book a year ago, all the way to working with governments such as the Ukraine in terms of working with them to rebuild their economy, and other governments, but also festivals and citizen assemblies and working also with the Pope in terms of how we bring different faith groups together. So I'll leave it at that. And I hope that during the panel discussion, we'll have a chance to speak a bit more thoroughly about some of these key barriers that we have to change, but also the incredible opportunities that we've seen if we start to embrace a well-being economy. Thank you very much.